Welcome to the webinar, Top Technologies Enabling the Net Zero Grid of the Future. My name is Jessica Hernandez, analyst here at Lux Research, and I will be moderating today's session. Presenting today is my colleague Chris Robinson, Research Director here at Lux Research. Throughout the webinar, you can type any questions you may have in the question box on your screen, and time permitting, we will answer all the questions that we can. If your question does not get answered this time, please do not hesitate to email it to questions@luxresearchinc.com and we will respond. Now let's jump into the presentation.
Thanks, Jessica. Now, when we talk about net zero grids, this is a hugely important part of global decarbonization roadmaps. And it's still a very challenging one. It's going to require us to scale and integrate a lot of new technologies into the grid in the future. And that's really what today's webinar is all about. So first, we'll start with challenges in building a net zero power grid in the future. Then we'll talk about some of the technologies that can be deployed to solve those challenges. And finally end with some advice on how to go about building these net zero power grids in the future. But first, we'll talk about challenges, because the challenges that we experience today integrating renewables are going to be different than the challenges we see in the future. And really the pace in which we need to make these changes is really dramatic. If we look at IEA's net zero electricity outlook for their net zero 2050 scenario, we need about 3 times more electricity to achieve the energy transition than we use today. And that primarily is because a lot of different industries are relying on low carbon electricity to decarbonize their own projects. So in the built environment, we see things like heat pumps, induction stoves replacing a gas infrastructure. In transportation, we see electric vehicles and to a lesser extent, hydrogen fuel cell vehicles with hydrogen derived from electricity, decarbonizing that sector. While also broader industry needs green hydrogen for decarbonizing processes like producing ammonia or steel. So this is kind of akin to trying to build the plane while we fly it, so to speak. We need to both change where we get electricity and how we operate the grid, while also integrating a large amount of load growth in the future. So what kind of challenges does that bring up? Well, with a little bit of renewables, it's really not much. So today I'm going to talk a lot about solar, some of the underlying, but I would say the underlying principles around managing intermittency are the same for other sources of generation, things like wind. I'm also going to share a lot of data from ERCOT. This is mostly illustrative, just to demonstrate the underlying principles are true everywhere. Their load profile is pretty typical of other regions, and it's worth noting ERCOT had some issues with reliability in the past. Now back to today, IEA forecasts are about 3% of electricity comes from solar, and Texas is pretty close to that. And you can see here that the amount of electricity coming from solar PV during the day is so much smaller than load that it doesn't really pose any reliability concerns. We could lose all of that solar in a short period of time, and the planning reserve margin in ERCOT is pretty close to the quantity of that solar. The challenges that we manage are really on a very short-term basis. Managing things like the clouds passing over solar panels, which creates minutes or seconds of changes in power outputs. So we've seen energy storage technologies deployed to kind of smooth out this curve, as well as the emergence of things like frequency regulation markets, which ultimately help to address these short-term fluctuations. But if we look further in the future, this is going to become a lot more problematic. By 2030, about half of the load during the day will be met by solar PV demand, as it's about 19% of electricity generation. There, it's a matter of managing some of the flexible gas capacity, ramping that up in the evening and nighttime hours. But if we think further to 2050 and then think about net zero grids, the problem becomes even harder. Almost all of the load during the day is met by PV generation, but none of it is met at night. Furthermore, you won't have access to natural gas capacity because of the emissions associated with that. Or if we do, it'll be very expensive with the carbon capture systems on them. So this is really the big challenge when we think about net zero grids. We can add renewables, but taking away thermal generation is arguably the bigger challenge. And to do that, we'll need a lot of new technologies. We need new storage technologies, grid management technologies. We probably need to think about redesigning electricity markets and even changing consumer behaviors around when they consume electricity. We're talking about major systemic changes to our power grid in the future. And ultimately, we really don't have a lot of time to do this. We started seeing small amounts of renewables added to the grid in the 2010s. That's really when we started thinking about the short-term fluctuations, and we saw batteries deployed for frequency regulation primarily. But by the 2020s, now we're seeing a lot more 4-hour lithium-ion systems for a small amount of load shifting. So not taking all the solar generated from the day, deploying at night, but starting to look at shifting some from the day to the evening hours to manage the ramp rate of thermal generation. But again, some changes required, no systemic changes needed. But if we truly pursue net zero grids, take away that fossil fuel-based generation, now we do need those mature technologies. And if we look at some of the global targets, things like the US pursuing net zero by 2035, Europe not too much further behind, we need to start deploying those technologies in the 2030s. Technologies that have not been scaled yet today. We have only 10 years. So that's what the rest of this webinar is going to focus on. What are those technologies that enable low cost and reliable grids? But we're now talking about reliability. And I think it's worth first spending a moment to talk about who plans for reliability and how is that done? And the answer to that is really, it's resource adequacy planning. Globally, it goes by a few different names. In the US, we talk about integrated resource plans. But essentially, this is all about forecasting demand you expect to have in your grid. So building load profiles for different types of customers, predicting different types of customer growth, then ultimately planning the right mix of generation to meet that. And ultimately, the integration of renewables presents a pretty significant challenge. How do you plan around intermittent sources of generation? Well, the answer to that is effective load carrying capability. And if you come away from one thing from this webinar, it's that I hope you understand what this concept is and how it impacts costs of building net zero reliable grids in the future. So effective load carrying capability, it's sometimes called a capacity credit, is really a measure of a specific generator, how much of that nameplate capacity contributes to reliability, which is a simple concept. Sometimes it's a little bit hard to understand. I think NREL's comparing resource adequacy metrics provides the best visualization of that. So let's pretend we're adding 1,000 megawatts of solar onto the grid. Well, we then go run a complex grid model to assess the reliability of a grid. So what we're calculating is the loss of load expectation. Essentially, given expected grid conditions, how many days throughout the year will you not have generation meet load? So the industry standard is 1 day in 10 years. So basically, in a given year, you can't have any more than 2.4 hours of time when load exceeds generation capacity. So you run your reliability model before and after adding the project, and you have these two curves, the blue and the green curve, which is with solar added. And this is somewhat intuitive. If we add generation, we increase reliability because we haven't increased load at all. But what we find is if we maintain and hold reliability constant, that we've essentially added 400 megawatts of reliable load that we can now serve. So the ELCC for this project would be 40%. So when those grid planners are doing their long-term resource adequacy planning, they can reliably count on about 40% of nameplate capacity from this project. Now, the challenge is that this is not a constant. Right? It varies with local grid mixes. It varies with different sources of loads on the network, and it just varies from project to project. And there's one universal truth, which is the more renewables that are deployed, the smaller this number becomes, which intuitively, again, makes sense. That first project where we add solar to the grid, it's not enough capacity to impact reliability. But once we get to something like 30, 40% solar, if you have a decrease in power output or a loss of solar, well, your grid certainly will notice it. And you're going to have a lot of events where you don't have enough generation to meet demand. So the big challenge is, how do you push these curves up? Because if we don't, we end up with a very expensive power grid that has a lot of excess capacity just to ensure reliability. So how do we push these curves up? Lux has identified three major technologies to do that. The first is flexible demand. If we can make consumers of electricity more flexible, we can shift when they need electricity away from peak load. We also need a variety of sources of generation. Over-reliance on just one type of generation in a grid mix will result in a lower reliability. And finally, but certainly not least, we need long-duration energy storage. So today we store energy for maybe 4 hours at a time. We need days, weeks, maybe even months at a time in the future. And I've displayed this graphically in a way that's similar to that recycling symbol, because this is not an either-or scenario. All of these things can work together and amplify the impacts of one on the other. So they all need to be deployed in the net zero grid of the future. So let's dive a little deeper into these. First, thinking about flexible demand. If we look once again at ERCOT load data and look at a full month of data, you can see that demand for electricity tends to vary. But we can look at those peaks of peak load and identify opportunities where shortly thereafter, load dropped below that 3-day rolling average. So it shows that we can increase the effective load carrying capability throughout the system if we are able to shave down that kind of peak load on the grid. Now, I've highlighted a few technologies on the right here that are relevant to flexibility. I would put a particular emphasis on DERMS. DERMS is a software platform, distributed energy resource management systems that essentially allow visibility and control into those assets from either aggregators or grid operators. And below that are a variety of different technologies that actually provide the flexibility. Now, we do have some level of flexibility today. We have relatively mature demand response programs, and we also have virtual power plants, which actually unlock some of the value behind distributed energy resources, like rooftop solar, behind the meter storage, et cetera. Now, what's happening here is a third-party aggregator is going in and aggregating a bunch of individual DERs owned by many different people potentially to act as one large power plant, which enables it to bid into wholesale markets. So essentially, you can actually make money from behind the meter renewables by doing this. It's a very established solution. Many people are doing this today, and it fits within current regulatory frameworks. However, I would argue it only indirectly benefits grid reliability. You have an aggregator that's essentially responding to a price signal in wholesale markets. So instead of grid operators being able to selectively dispatch or even collectively dispatch assets, they access that capacity through the aggregator, who's kind of playing a guessing game as to when will prices be high. So obviously, wholesale markets, they send price signals based on congestion. So if there's not enough generation, prices will increase, incentivizing more people to participate in that virtual power plant. But because grid operators aren't controlling it, I would argue it's indirectly benefiting. We can allow grid operators to directly improve grid reliability by thinking about DER marketplaces. It essentially moves that marketplace from a wholesale to a distribution network, where now all of the individual owners of assets can make that capacity available in a marketplace, and the grid operator or other folks in that network can access that capacity. So much better control and visibility into the capacity of DERs, but doesn't really neatly fit within today's regulatory frameworks, and it requires some potentially significant changes, setting up a new marketplace and engaging asset owners to set that up. But it's a good example of the systemic changes required for net zero grids. And this is being piloted today. Project Trader was a pilot in the UK that ran between 2019 and 2021. And essentially what I think is interesting about this is a few things. I think it's the first working example of a third-party facilitated DER market with automated dispatch. So there's less changes needed at the DSO level. There were also demonstrated localized benefits. So because you had a diversity of assets, things like a wind farm operator, owners of behind the meter storage assets, as well as consumers, there was one service provided, which was demand turnup. So if there's a lot of renewable generation available, wholesale markets, prices are falling low, maybe a wind farm operator is facing curtailment, they can look for sources of demand throughout their network and actually be connected with specific consumers of electricity. So that gives the consumer a lower price for electricity because they're paying lower than their typical rate is, but helps wind farm operators avoid curtailment. So this project actually demonstrated some of the localized benefits of a DER marketplace compared to a virtual power plant, where you might be aggregating units widespread throughout a network and still actually using distribution and transmission infrastructure. So the second step is using a variety of sources of generation. Now here, I think one thing that's notable about ERCOT's grid is that they were able to weather a relatively severe weather event where they were setting historic lows and seeing basically a severe winter storm because they had a diversity of assets. Now they actually saw low availability in their gas network because much of that is not winterized. And during the winter storm, a lot of the equipment essentially froze, as did some of the wind capacity, but not quite to an extreme event as natural gas capacity. But it was able to rely on nuclear generation, coal-fired generation to, in part, meet grid demand. They did have rolling blackouts, but they did avoid a complete grid failure where they needed a black start event, which would have taken months to recover from. So we need other sources of generation, but we can't rely on coal and gas in this net zero future. And luckily, there are potential solutions to other sources of generation to complement wind and solar. Marine power is probably the least mature and emerging today. Essentially, you're harvesting energy from motion in waves or in tides. So here we've shown Core Power's ocean buoy. Essentially, it moves up and down with waves, powering a generator to produce electricity. Now, the benefit here is, yes, these are intermittent sources of generation, but the load profile is different than wind and solar, and the situations you might have an outage are also different from wind and solar. So they complement each other quite well. And what I would highlight here is that all of these companies are essentially entering the pilot stage over the next few years. So we're about to learn a lot more about the operational characteristics and ultimately the levelized cost of electricity that comes from these sources of generation. We also have geothermal power, and if you have this available, like Iceland in this picture with a lot of volcanic activity that makes geothermal very feasible, this is an ideal choice. Now, because this is a source of thermal power generation, but one that does not use fossil fuels, you have a near flat generation profile. And that's also true for nuclear, right? These are also essentially thermal power plants that get their heat from fission and potentially even fusion in the future, as there was a major breakthrough on a net positive energy production from fusion in the DOE just last week. And both geothermal and nuclear feature near flat generation profiles, capacity factors 95% and above. So all of these types of solutions can help complement solar and wind to improve grid reliability. And finally, we have long duration energy storage. And I mentioned we've already deployed a lot of 4-hour systems today. In the future, I think as we once again revisit this month of ERCOT load data, there were opportunities if we look at peak load to see that in the preceding days or hours before that, there were opportunities where load was below that 3-day rolling average where they could have, in theory, been charging up a battery to dispatch essentially lowering effective net load. So again, lowering that likelihood that you don't have enough generation to meet demand and improving those ELCC curves. Now, there are a lot of technologies that can be deployed for long duration. None have been deployed at scale yet, but I would highlight one metric we use to compare technology, which is admittedly imperfect, but pretty good at comparing technologies on duration and system size, is the levelized cost of storage, which essentially accounts for all of the costs of a project, as well as all of the operational characteristics like round-trip efficiency, where you lose some energy during charging each cycle of the battery. Now, there are a few characteristics that are ideal for long-duration storage technologies. Decoupled power and energy is the primary one. So unlike a lithium-ion battery, where to add more storage, you add more cells, which inherently give you more power, whether you want it or not, decoupled systems like flow batteries or liquefied air storage allow you to essentially scale just the energy component. In a flow battery, you can build bigger tanks with more liquids in them to store more energy without having to scale up the dollar per kilowatt size of that membrane stack in the middle. These projects should also feature low materials and maintenance costs because they're very sensitive to CapEx. We're typically talking about projects that have a large kilowatt hour rating associated with them, and ideally a long project lifetime to amortize these costs over a long period of time. So this is the map that we use to identify what are the lowest cost storage technologies given a variety of discharge duration and system powers. And what we can see is that up until this point, we really haven't needed anything other than a lithium-ion battery, right? It provides up to 4 hours. We've scaled this up to almost a gigawatt scale for battery systems. And this is primarily, we saw these systems coming online in the 2010s, primarily to deal with frequency regulation, but also increasing in the 2020s to think about load shifting. Now, we will need to shift more than 4 hours of energy. So I think here it's fair to say we can start thinking about 16 to 24 hours of storage. And that's when flow batteries start to become competitive with lithium ion, with lower costs at those longer durations. But ultimately, if we're thinking about net zero grids, we probably need days, weeks, maybe even months of storage. And here there is literally and figuratively an enormous white space here. Zinc air on paper looks great, but there are some practical considerations like a weekly zinc stripping cycle potentially that would make this a less ideal kind of energy storage technology, even if its cost adjusted to the lowest. And hydrogen, I happen to think is going to be very competitive here. It's very expensive today, but as industry adopts a greater consumption and production of hydrogen for decarbonizing their own projects, some of these costs will fall, and I think we'll see this kind of teal hydrogen corner start to become a bit bigger in the future. So these are the technologies required for building a net zero grid in the future. They are aimed at increasing flexibility of demand, varying the sources of generation, and pursuing long duration energy storage. These are the key solutions that we need to focus on as we're building net zero grids. And I would highlight this list of technologies is not completely exhaustive. They will continue to get longer and longer over time. But these are the key technologies Lux thinks we should be focused on. Now, as we look toward the future, I think there are a few things we need to keep in mind. And one is this concept that electricity will be too cheap to meter will not happen. We expect electricity to be more expensive. And there's some nuance here, right? I think it's true that just the pure production of net zero electricity will become cheaper. Solar and wind continue to work down their cost trajectories and learning curves, and they will become very cheap. However, all of the things we just talked about, adding energy storage to the grid, pursuing more flexibility, and maybe keeping a grid mix that isn't all just about the lowest cost produced electricity, but contains sources of generation that have varying profiles that enhance reliability, those things will all make electricity more expensive. So here I've kind of shown you as the capacity credit decreases, if we also think about the amount of storage that needs to be added to the grid, the marginal integration cost of adding more renewables continues to increase. And some of the work we're doing at Lux right now is to further extend this all the way to 100 and investigate the impacts of things like long duration storage. When do we need those and how much more expensive does it make renewables integration? I also think we need to think about pursuing much more novel sources of flexibility. I mentioned we already have demand response and virtual power plants today, but California's emergency load reduction program, I think, is very interesting because essentially what's happening is instead of going through an aggregator that aggregates a lot of capacity and bids it to a wholesale market, what it's doing is really eliminating the aggregator. So they will look at the load profile expected for a given day. If you're called upon for an emergency load reduction event, it will then analyze your load profile during the event and compensate you based on the difference between those at a rate of $2 per kilowatt hour, which is very favorable. And it's even a program flexible enough that they're integrating vehicle to grid charging, so you can export power as part of this program. And that's very similar to what AutoGrid and Zoom are doing today. They've built what I think is the largest virtual power plant, certainly the largest for incorporating vehicle to grid, leveraging school buses. And I think this is actually an interesting application where you have a very large amount of capacity from heavy duty school buses. You have a very high level of visibility into the schedule, so you know when that capacity will be available. And you have essentially an application where there's a lot of downtime. So there's a lot of time you have available to use that capacity. So would typically be available in a time of a grid emergency. And longer term, I think we can also think about setting up DER marketplaces. And if I were a distribution system operator or a DSO, I would be picking up the phone and calling GreenSync. They are a company that's the most advanced in this space, and they essentially create a software platform that allows DSOs to create their own DER marketplaces and begin engaging with consumers of DERs to get that set up. And lastly, just because we don't need long duration storage today, we will need it in the future. And we can still pilot long duration energy storage technologies using today's grid storage needs. In a California microgrid, a flow battery was used, where even though lithium-ion solution would probably be preferred, this project was exploring whether or not the response time of a flow battery is fast enough to switch between grid and microgrid power. Within mechanical storage, this is an image of Highview Power's liquefied air energy storage system. They're building a 50 megawatt, 300 megawatt hour system right now that's essentially scaling up from their smaller pilot facility, but actually leveraging existing transmission and distribution infrastructure, citing that project where a previous fossil fuel plant was located. And finally, thinking about hydrogen storage, one kind of out-of-the-box idea is using ammonia-fired turbines. This is something that Mitsubishi Heavy Industries is pursuing. Now, the question of hydrogen storage as long-duration storage is, how do you store the hydrogen? One option is to store hydrogen in the form of ammonia, and then fire that ammonia in a turbine. Now, you would need a carbon capture solution of some kind to offset emissions from this, but this would act and behave very similar to existing natural gas infrastructure on the grid. To conclude today's webinar and leave you with a few thoughts, one is that the big challenge in a net zero grid is reliability. And when we think about reliability, technologies that improve the effective load carrying capability of renewables projects is really critical to building net zero grids that are both reliable and low cost. Today, the biggest opportunity is to start thinking about demand flexibility, but think about novel sources of generation not typically used today, or novel sources of flexibility, I should say, things like EV chargers, behind the meter batteries, et cetera. And finally, pursue long duration projects, but consider using long duration technology in today's 4-hour systems that you'd normally use lithium-ion batteries to prepare and make sure the technology is scaled for the future, and also leverage regulatory support in the form of subsidies and grants to actually build these projects. So with that, we can now move into the question and answer portion of today's webinar.
Thank you very much for that, Chris. We will now be taking questions from the audience that you may have from the presentation today. You can type your questions on the questions box on your screen. If you do not get a response from us today during this call, someone from Lux will be in touch after the webinar. So looking at the questions we have here so far, starting with one regarding the transmission grid. So where does transmission play into the net zero grid? And do we have any insights on whether or if that space needs to be updated from a technology point of view?
Thanks, Jessica. So transmission capacity is really incredibly important when we think about the future of a net zero power grid, because we're probably going to be making renewable electricity like solar and wind places that's not necessarily close to demand. So we already see this. I referenced Texas in my presentation a few times. If you look at locational marginal pricing in Texas, it's really low in the Northwest where there's a lot of wind capacity, but typically higher in Houston where there's really sources of demand and there's just not enough transmission capacity to move that energy long distances. And I think we'll see that in a lot of different regions of the world. So we need more transmission capability. It's an incredibly challenging thing to build. It takes a long time, which is not good considering the pace we need to make changes. So we've seen a couple of technologies, things like superconducting wires that can essentially move more electricity with the existing infrastructure we have. We haven't done a lot of work on that at Lux, but in theory, that would unlock a lot more transmission value without having to actually go through the process of building new infrastructure and engaging with ratepayers, other consumers that might be impacted by where you're going to build these, because we've seen big transmission projects essentially voted down in the past. So transmission is really important, really hard to build and takes a long time. So anything we can do to improve transmission infrastructure today is really important.
Right. Yeah, and also considering the mix, as you said, we have to have a good mix for a reliable net zero grid of the future. So transmission will be crucial. We have time for one more question, depending on how lengthy your answer is, maybe two. But you mentioned vehicle to grid as an alternative, as a novel source of flexibility. So how real of an opportunity is this?
So I think vehicle to grid is really a massive untapped opportunity. Maybe not today, but certainly that's true in the future. So we've done some kind of back of the envelope calculations using some of our EV forecasts. So if we think back to the Texas example, by 2040, in theory, there's 25 to 30 gigawatts of flexible capacity in vehicles if everyone has, a 6.6 kilowatt charger in their home. So you're obviously never going to get all of that, but even a portion of that, if you can, as a grid operator, say maybe 20% of that is going to be reliably available. That is a potentially huge source of flexibility that can be untapped. And if we pair that with DER marketplaces, where you can solve a lot of local grid constraints without tapping into transmission infrastructure, to reference our previous question, it becomes really even more powerful. So, whenever I talk to a lot of our utility clients or automaker clients, I really try and stress that the importance this will have in the future. So I would view it as really a potentially very big opportunity.
Yeah, completely agree. Electric mobility is a huge opportunity, starting already, even if people are thinking about V2G as maybe it's something of the future. Like right now, even tapping into smart charging is going to make a big difference. Well, thank you very much for your insights today, Chris. That concludes our webinar today. The slide presentation and recording from this webinar will be sent to all attendees via email. After leaving the webinar, you will be prompted to complete a survey on today's presentation. We would appreciate any feedback you may have to help inform and improve future webinars. And take a moment and check out our upcoming webinars. Thank you very much for joining us and have a great rest of your day.
Thank you.